name is David Wolpe. I'm a rabbi from Los Angeles. I'm one of the judges of the nonfiction prize, but the Sami Rohr Prize is unique in at least two ways. One is that it alternates between fiction and nonfiction each year, thereby taking in really the entirety of Jewish letters. And also it is unique in that it is based primarily, but not solely, on the book. We also interview the authors, and both the finalists and the winners are people who the judges feel will make a contribution in the future to the world of Jewish learning and to the world of Jewish culture. So it is an honor given not just to a piece of work, but to the person who produced that work. And that makes it wonderful and beautiful. In 2006, it was established by the children of Sami Rohr to honor his extraordinary literacy and vision, and now, of course, continues on in his memory. So because his family is here this evening, we celebrate you and your continuation of this wonderful vision as we celebrate our authors, who I am now just going to introduce with a word, and then we'll start a conversation. To my immediate right is Leff, who is the author of The Archive Thief, about which you will hear more. Next to her is Yehudah Mirsky, who is the author of the biography of Rav Kook in the Yale University series. And to my far right is Aviya Kushner, who is author of The Grammar of God. And with that, let's have a conversation. Okay, so I warned you this was going to be my opening question, so I feel no pangs of conscience in asking it. But we live in an age of Twitter, so in 2 sentences, which actually is more ample than Twitter would afford you, tell us what your book is about, and if you want to add a 3rd sentence about why we should all read it, that would be okay too. So I'll start, Aviya, with you and come.
Okay, The Grammar of God is about the experience of reading the Bible in translation after a whole life of reading it in Hebrew, and about the great surprises that that experience contained.
And we should read it because?
Let's see, I think every translation is an interpretation, and I think that the translation that you read affects your understanding of the Tanakh in unexpected ways.
Beautiful. Yehudah?
So my book is an attempt to present the lifetime's thought of a colossal thinker who played a really major role in creating much of modern Jewish history as the founder of the chief rabbinate of Israel, and more importantly, the most significant rabbinic figure and thinker to endorse Zionism, and who is still, to this day, the leading thinker behind religious Zionism. Sentence number 1.
Those subordinate clauses.
I know, they'll get you every time, don't you? Sentence number 2. A man, his story is, so to speak, the sacred history of the contradictions of modern Jewish history.
I remember reading about Henry James that once he was talking to someone at the theater and the lights were flashing and so on. He said, "Patience, madam, the predicate is coming." So,
Mark Twain's joke about sitting at the hours in a German opera and saying, "I'm waiting for the verb."
Right. Lisa.
A Jewish historian stole tens of thousands of documents from European archives during and after the Holocaust. Was it rescue or theft?
And we should read it to find out the answer. Okay, wonderful. So let me ask 1 or 2 general questions before asking specifically about your books, which is it's the world of Jewish literature and writing in general, like all of modern scholarship, is changing. Could you have written this book 50 years ago? Would it have been a very different book? I'll start this time with you.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, my book is looking at someone, it's a biographical approach. It's about a person, but it's not about a great man. You know, it's not a biography of a hero. And I think especially in the Jewish world, it's only recently that we've felt secure enough to start writing histories of complicated figures who are neither heroes nor villains, and were willing to look at these kind of more ambiguous and smaller figures who are maybe more like ourselves and whose stories tell us something very different than stories of heroes.
Yehudah, could you have written, I mean, obviously.
Well, in some ways the answer is yes and no. Yes, because someone did. In 1946, Jacob Agus wrote a volume about Rav Kook, not unlike mine, called Banner of Jerusalem. I think it's held up remarkably well, given all the publications and manuscripts of Rav Kook to which he did not have access. He did a wonderful job. So that's the yes part. The no part is that that book of his was published by a Jewish press and not by a mainstream American university press. So I think 50 years ago, a biography of a 20th century very Orthodox rabbi would not have passed muster. And in the case of Rav Kook, there's a lot of translation involved, literal and figurative, and sort of getting American people who can read and deal with these materials. There were some 50 years ago, but nowadays more, and certainly for readers.
Aviya.
So your question is, could a book like this have been written 50 years ago? And I think my answer to that is I'm not sure, but I'm certain that 100 years ago it would have been impossible. And the reason I'm certain is if you look at Jewish translations of the Tanakh that are 100 years old, like the Jewish Publication Society translation from 1917, you will notice that it's often very close to the King James. And you can feel, at least I felt, the fear in the Jewish community. The fear of having a very overt Jewish interpretation and this constant desire to include Christian understanding. So I would say 100 years ago, no way. I think 50, it gets a little muddled.
On this lightning round, I want to ask you each something about your book specifically. Yehudah, about the Rav Kook biography. It's a beautiful, lyrical, and still very clear biography. And to any pulpit rabbi, it brings great comfort. Because you're reading about a figure incomparably greater than you are, but he got bogged down in politics too. And I was astonished. It was like I kept saying, you're bothering Rav Kook, don't you realize? This is Rav Kook.
You fools, leave him alone.
So I wonder, did it surprise you how much of his life was absorbed in bickering?
It was striking.
Not his own bickering.
It was very striking to me. He in politics, like everything else with him, it's sort of complicated. In some respects, for him to get involved in politics was kind of inevitable because so much of his teaching is about taking responsibility for your life and your times and your society and being engaged with the life around you. And because one of his innovations as a thinker was to take Kabbalistic doctrines and ideas from the Jewish mystical tradition and project them onto concrete social and political movements in his time. And he may have been the first thinker in the Kabbalistic tradition to do that. At the same time, his understanding of politics was very idealistic, certainly of Jewish politics. What we think of as politics, the endless compromising, the pettiness, the this, the that, he saw that as non-Jewish politics. He saw it as morally corrosive, and he saw it as non-Jewish politics. He thought, imagined, hoped that Jewish politics would be different. Jewish politics in a new land of Israel would be different. And the results have been decidedly mixed.
Lisa, so there is this principle that we know primarily from, I suppose it really became common among Jewish scholars in Gershom Sholom's work on Shabtai Tzvi, and then Jacob Frank, mitzvah haba avera, a mitzvah that comes through a sin. I know that this is kind of asking you the question that you said they should read the book to find out, but was this theft a mitzvah that was done through a sin, or was it a sin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So was he diving into the mire somehow?
And maybe give a little bit more background as to what about the
did.
theft in French history.
Yeah. So Zosa Tchaikovsky, who's the person that I wrote about, started taking things illegally for the archives, for American and Israeli collections, starting during World War II, and a lot of what he was taking was documentation that he found, especially in Berlin, that he found in bombed out Nazi ministries. And he took them back to New York, where they've been used by scholars. And then after the war, he kept doing it, except in France, from synagogues that were in operation, and also from public archives, like the National Archives of France. And he brought them back to America, and he used them, and then he sold them off. And now it kind of built a whole field of French Jewish history in America, because we use these documents to write history. So, I mean, the question really is appropriate, right? He gave birth to this field of French Jewish history by bringing things out, but he stole them. I would say, I mean, when I looked at his motivations, his goal was to write history, and he didn't care about ownership. And I think in that sense, we can't erase that what he did was a sin, right? He did not respect that he knew these things were owned by other people. And I'm not talking so much about in the World War II, but in its aftermath. But I think this question of is it a mitzvah plays into the whole story, because those libraries that bought from him, they're the ones that bought because they believed that even though probably they knew that this stuff had been stolen, they were buying it because they believed they were redeeming it, right? That they were that the end result was good, and it was that belief that motivated them to kind of collude in this. So I kind of turn what you're saying, from this kind of like, well, let's celebrate the sin because there was something good in it, and rather say, this kind of story should make us very conscious of the ambiguity of our actions, that these things, sin and mitzvah, aren't so fully separate from one another as we're trying to deliberate when we're making much lower stakes ethical decisions. We need to see them together, right? How do they sit together?
And part of the drama of your book, which is a very dramatic book for a scholarly book, for a nonfiction, we're afraid of the word scholarly, but it is a scholarly book, but it doesn't read like one. But part of the drama is it is his internal sense also of whether what he's doing is okay or not.
Right, and I feel like that, he's a person whose personality remains constant, this drive for the archives to take it. And as the context shifts, of course, that drive means one thing in World War II, Jewish chaplains all over, who were with the United States forces all over Europe, were doing lots of things that were illegal because the law didn't allow them to do what was right. And it was very common to, go off base to go and help DPs, right? This is something that the chaplains did. But in the 1950s, right, to keep going into the archives to take things, well, but Tchaikovsky's mind, right, remained in that extra legal place.
Aviya, I want to ask you a question that is somewhat about your book, but not exactly, and that is that the reason, obviously, that the American Jewish community is so needful of translation and understanding translation is because we don't speak Hebrew. Yeah. And it's impossible to read a book like yours and both be unaware of the nuances and the interests and the way in which translation even influences Hebrew speakers, but at the same time lament the fact that you can't, as a rabbi, you can't get up in front of the congregation and give a drash that depends on a nuance in the Hebrew unless you so elaborately explain the Hebrew that by the time you're done, it's as long as this question. So why don't we?
Oh, what a question. Well,
and how could we?
Yeah. Well, you're speaking to the heart of what motivated me here. I actually believe that the American Jewish community made a historic mistake in not emphasizing Hebrew, in always making Hebrew something on the sidelines. Hebrew teachers, like my mother, they're never the people in charge, And it's very sad because without a strong understanding of Hebrew, you really are handicapped, I think, reading the Tanakh and reading Jewish law and reading many Jewish texts if you don't understand the way the Hebrew language works. So what can we do? I think First of all, I think we have to start early. And I think we have to really start very early with Hebrew for children. And I also think that we have to make a big effort to respect the Hebrew language and the teachers of it. And I think we all know that. Most yeshivas, with all due respect, a rabbi will be in charge.
Right.
Almost never a writer, almost never a language teacher, and I think it's a problem. And it makes me very sad. I'll tell you, when I first moved to Chicago, I was saddened that between aliyot, the rabbi there felt the need to explain what was coming up in an Orthodox shul, what was coming up in the aliyah. And I thought, unbelievable. An Orthodox shul, I would hope that you would be able to make it through a couple of psukim and understand. So I think that to think of Hebrew as a stepchild, or maybe something that's just Hebrew literature at 4 p.m. is a mistake. Yeah.
And what do non-Hebrew speakers, if you can isolate this, and it may be too broad a question, what do they miss most in not having the language?
It's a great question. I would say the short answer in one word is layers. I think what's awesome about Hebrew is that it's a multi-layered language, and that one word can have multiple meanings, multiple contexts, and also multiple historic contexts, like a modern context, an ancient context, a medieval context. And I think that non-Hebrew speakers are limited to one layer. So it's not that you don't get anything from reading a translation, you get something. But if there are 4 layers, you get one.
Right. And you give illustrations of some words and their multiple layers. And it does strike me that 2 of the 3 books here, in a way, have their origins in Hebrew.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And on the other hand, 2 of the 3 books here are biographies. So,
Well,
you score on both.
Well,
Yehudah. So tell me how
if I could say a word about Hebrew.
do, and also tell us about the complexity of Rav Kook's Hebrew.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That was
Sure.
Hebrew.
Yeah.
Well, first about Hebrew, there's a general fact that Americans don't learn languages.
That's right.
Generally, it's not an American thing
Right.
to learn language. But the second, in terms of American Hebrew, I have to acknowledge my sister and my brother are here with us this evening. And they well remember both our father and our grandfather, each in their time, were the presidents of something that was called the Histadrut Ivrit Ba'Amerika, the Hebrew Federation of America, which was part of this Hebraist movement, which is Professor Alan Mintz has famously put it, is one of the best kept secrets of American Jewish history. Right? That for some decades, there was this thriving Hebrew movement in America, and it ended. It ended for a bunch of reasons. As my brother pointed out once, this is one of the few sort of areas in Zionist movements where a lot of the people who believed in it actually went and moved to Israel, so much for that. But also, Michael Weingrad wrote a wonderful book a few years ago about the literary fortunes of the Hebrew movement in America. And he sort of pointed out that in literary terms, they were wedded to a kind of classicism, and they were still wedded to Bialik when everybody else was on to symbolism and expressionism. But just yesterday, 2 days ago, Michael had an essay which was, I forget where he first wrote it, but it was posted on Mosaic, and he made a really sharp observation that for American Jews, he argues, and I think there's a lot to this, to learn Hebrew means to get off the sidelines, in a sense. It means to put away the studied irony, ambivalence, outsiderness that is so precious and dear to American Jews' sense of themselves. And it's a very subtle point, but I think he was really, really on to something. With Rav Kook's Hebrew, it's kind of sui generis, because unlike most thinkers, Rav Kook's canonical works of thought come out of spiritual diaries that he kept for himself. It's almost no other Jewish mystics kept spiritual diaries like he did. And he wrote in his own kind of language, which was all about these layers, right? He's mixing modern Hebrew in every register, biblical, Talmudic, rabbinic, midrashic. He's studded with allusions because he's thinking.
And did he intend those to be?
By and large, not. He didn't
Because-
intend them for publication. He starts keeping this diary when he's a rabbi in a shtetl, a young rabbi in a shtetl, and does it through his whole life. When he writes things that are deliberately for public consumption, they're a little more studied, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They tend not to be as interesting.
So Yeats said that with our arguments with others, we make rhetoric, and our arguments with ourselves, we make poetry.
Beautiful.
And
yes.
his poetry, there's a lot of poetry.
There's a lot of,
in
because
his-
when he actually sits down and tries to write poetry, it comes out very wooden and very stilted and very didactic and not something you would want to read unless you were deeply interested in him. And in this journal writing, this sort of stunning gushes, thousands of pages of sort of, it reads like free association until if you're familiar with the Kabbalistic and philosophical sources that he's working with, you see there's this like fantastic poetic gust and stream, and if you pay close attention to the language, he's actually working out technical issues in philosophy or reconceptualizing Kabbalistic doctrines as he goes.
So, to turn to a very different personality, did he have, and this is what you were saying actually made me think about it, did Tchaikovsky have a conception of what Jewish history was? And was he stealing documents to a point, or was he just trying to preserve stuff just because he didn't want anything to be lost?
It's so interesting listening to Yehudah talk about, and both of you actually talking about language and layers of meaning. Because one of the theories I have about Tchaikovsky is that his relationship to all these things of the Jewish past, all these documents of the Jewish past, is almost like a mystic's relationship to language. Mm-hmm. And that he's, did anyone read the book The Bee Season? This Michael Goldberg novel where there's this character who goes and collects shiny things and makes she has a mental illness.
And has Kabbalistic.
And it has Kabbalistic stuff, and she's made this beautiful mosaic with all of these found objects. And sometimes I think of Tchaikovsky that way, that because so in his work, what he did with these, when he was a historian, he, instead of, as a historian, my training is to digest all of the documents that I find, read them, digest them, and then tell a story based on them. But the documents disappear, right? I write a narrative. When you read my book, you don't see the documents, you just see the sense I made of them. Tchaikovsky would never do that. For him, it's a mosaic of the documents of the past, right? So that you see them in all of their layers. It was more for him about making documents visible, these things of the Jewish past. And there's something, he's totally secular. He's not even a good Hebrew speaker, right? He's working in a very different tradition, but there's something almost mystical when you think about the practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say, one of the things that moved me deeply, there was a lot of things I loved in your book, but one of the things that moved me really deeply is when you conjure up this picture, especially especially somehow with the chapter about pre-war Paris, him and this circle of people, these emigre Jewish sociologists, for peace sake, who think that they're somehow going to keep Jewish, whatever this beating heart of Jewish history is, they're going to keep it alive through archival research and sociology, and just the passion that they're applying to this just like moved the daylights out of me.
Yeah.
Sort of the way you conjured it up there.
Well, we do have like Hebraist, Kabbalist, historian.
Right.
We have a lot of the Jewish, of the Jewish attempts to preserve the Jewish past and make it live, represented in both your personas and your books here.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it does speak to and in that sense, maybe these couldn't have been written a long time ago because both the successes and the failures of all of those groups have only become clear in the past probably half century.
Or how consequential they've been. Jewish history as a form of Jewish identity,
right. Yes.
Kabbalah's place, and also in the place of Rav Kook, a theologian, Kabbalist, who actually had a profound effect on on politics down to the present, and the vicissitudes of Hebrew, and the rediscovery, also the literary turn in biblical studies, right, which is so significant for your work, happens just in the last few decades.
When you said he had a profound effect on the politics,
right.
Please don't take this example too literally. But was his son sort of the St. Paul That is, were the politics really affected by Tzvi Yehudah Kook or by Rav Kook? Was Rav Kook the theoretician and the figure, but his son was the one who translated it into the doctrines that actually spread to everyone who they believed?
Well, it's the $64,000 question. And it's a question also that I'm very torn by, because I'm sort of trying to look at all of this dispassionately as an historian on the one hand, and also at the same time as somebody who's very engaged in these questions. Sort of the short answer, perhaps Weasley answer, right? He's a large and capacious thinker who admits of many interpretations. The elements that his son, Rav Tzvi Yehudah, builds on, and just for those who are not familiar, Rav Kook's son Tzvi Yehudah, via his interpretation of his father's teachings, and he succeeds his father as the head of his father's yeshiva, becomes sort of the spiritual godfather of the settlement movement, starting in the late 60s, but especially taking off in the 1970s and down to the present. The elements that Tzvi Yehudah works with are there in Rav Kook. There's no denying that they're there. There are other, a lot of the questions are, how do you want to read him? Do you want to read him as a sacred text? Do you want to read him as a guide to political action in the present? Do you want to read him as a canon that can brook no contradiction? And then if the answer to all those is yes, then yeah, you get something that perhaps looks a good deal like Rav Tzvi Yehudah. And then there's this question, of course, should a theologian like Rav Kook be read for manifest political content at all? Right? Especially somebody in those sorts of Kabbalistic doctrines, or can he be translated in different ways? One of the knocks on my book, right, one of the reviewers, Alan Nadler, said that I wrote a very good book about a really important figure whose ideas were far more dangerous than I was willing to admit. And I think there's something to that.
That
but
probably
again,
makes people want to read the book.
But a
though.
lot
That
of
was
it goes on how you
So-
on how you choose to read him. And the last thing I'll say, especially in the political context, our interpretive choices are moral choices.
So that's a good lead into interpretation and moral choices. One of the things, again, that I found interesting as far as the backstory, Aviya, of your book, is that Marilyn Robinson, who's probably the most morally, probably has the most defined moral posture of any modern novelist that I can think of anyway. And certainly is the greatest inheritor of a moral tradition of any modern American novelist. That she's the one who, in a sense, sparked not your interest, but your commitment to write about this. And I wonder if you would speak about the interplay between her traditionalism and understanding of the Bible and your instruction of her and what the Bible was really, how it was written.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, as you probably know, Marilyn is very much a Calvinist. She has a very particular view of Christianity. I myself was so unfamiliar with Christianity that I don't think I understood initially that her view was very particular. And but I was actually fortunate that another early reader of mine, Chris Merrill, who's the head of Iowa's international writing program and has written several books on Christian thought, he took the time to explain to me that, this is how some mainstream Christian thinkers think about this, and this is the Calvinist point of view. One of the things you want to do is separate those two, which I felt was helpful, so just want to credit him as well. I think that studying with Marilyn made it very real for me just how dominant the Christian understanding of some key passages is in our society. And I think that there was very little dispute of it in the classroom. It was widely accepted. So I think that was the main thing that I really got from working with her. I think I was shocked by it, by just how accepted it was. And
how much of a big part of that was that it's known in English.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a small point that I thought about a lot was just how the book was referred to. It was constantly referred to as the Bible. And early on, I kept thinking, no, this is not the Bible. This is a translation of the Bible. And there was no discussion of that word translation. It was just like the Bible. And I think we hear that now in our political conversation. You'll hear politicians say, the Bible says. They'll never say, the RSV translation says. And so that was one of the things that really motivated me, the way the words of the Bible were thrown around by, as you say, major moral authorities, major novelists, without any thought to the Hebrew original.
Do you think, just as a follow-up, that part of the
Yeah.
reason that that's true is because the New Testament actually doesn't have an original?
It's a great question. And I think one of the things that, okay, so I think it's fair to say that in the Christian world, the New Testament is of great importance. Obviously, in the Jewish world, it's not of great importance. But one of the things that Marilyn emphasized to me is that in recent decades, Christian scholars have become more and more interested in what Christians call the Old Testament. There's been a greater respect for it and more time in the classroom. So I think that, yes, that's true to some extent, but I think in the Christian community, there's growing awareness of it.
Well, I also mean in original language. Like
Correct,
the New Testament,
right.
we don't have the language that it was originally written in.
Right.
So to say you have to pay attention to the original language in the New
Right.
Testament doesn't have the same force
Right.
as it does in the Hebrew
Right.
Bible.
I would agree, but I think I felt more, just because I was more deeply attached to what we call the Tanakh, I felt much more about that. But I did, take the New Testament class. I did go to the church class for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and listened into how that was discussed. But for me personally, I was much more interested in what had happened to Hebrew.
How consequential and shaping, as a historian of French Jewry, how consequential and shaping were the documents that he saved? I mean, without them, would our conception of French Jewish history and European Jewish history be very different from what it is?
So very early on when I was doing this project, I gave a talk at NYU. It was before I published anything. I gave a talk at NYU, and probably the foremost historian of French Jewry, who is French, happened to be in New York, and he came to the talk, and he listened, he raised his hand, and he said, "Lisa, I think you have Stockholm Syndrome. Like, this is not, you've spent far too much time with this man, and he is absolutely inconsequential. Yes, he stole many things, but everything he stole is copies. And the originals are, there are many, it would be like circular, or a copy of a sermon, a printed up sermon. There'd be a copy in some, that Tchaikovsky stole, and then there's another copy still back in France." So this was the point that this man was making. He's like, so it totally doesn't matter. You could have found it anyway in France. But the fact of the matter is, no one did. And that's because of where it was, right? When it's in French archives, because French Jews never really wrote their own histories, they were very assimilated. And they weren't necessarily interested in thinking of themselves as Jews. And when they became historians, they were French historians or American historians. They weren't doing Jewish history. It's actually when those documents, copies though many of them are, wind up in American institutions that American Jews have a far stronger sense of their Jewish identity, went after them. And then they went back to France and did more research and found other things. But it's like they needed to be put in a Jewish collection for people to think about them as Jewish documents. So I would say, yeah, but it's not a simple, like, he saved them and now we have them. It's like he called attention to them as Jewish. And then all of a sudden people thought about them as Jewish and not, and didn't just pass them over.
And is that in French Jewish studies, is that a constant sort of blurring of boundaries? Is this French history? Is this Jewish history?
Exactly. And Jewish history in France exists now, but it's much more marginal than it is in the United States.
So, do we have questions? Do we have someone has a microphone, I believe, so that you can be heard.
Thank you all for writing your books. They're brilliant. I wonder if you could each tell us what inspired you to write the specific book that you wrote.
1, 2, 3.
Okay. When I was a graduate student, I had to write a dissertation in French Jewish history, and I went to the archives in France to look for things, and there were notable gaps. And when I finally got the courage to ask, what is going on here? This was especially true in the synagogue, in the main synagogue in Paris, where it was just like, they'd just come back and they'd be like, It's not there, sorry, And eventually,
Very
asking
French of you.
Yeah, exactly. And then they're like, we got to go for a 3-hour lunch break now. But eventually I asked, and then this is when I heard this crazy story, and I got it confirmed. When I started talking to senior scholars in my field who had been around for a while, they were like, oh yeah. And then I realized that the things that I had seen already in New York before I ever went to France, the reason they were there was that they had been stolen by this historian whose work I knew very well, and sold here. And it was like all of a sudden as if, what I thought of as intellectual issues that were only in theoretical, from the writings, had this physical life to them. When you think about a historian went before you and messed with the archives, so everything you're seeing is shaped by his handprint, right, and his kind of surreptitious activity. It totally changes the way you think about research. Now that I published this book, I can't tell you how many times I get emails from people that say, I was at the YIVO archives and I was looking for this or that and it wasn't there. Do you think? And it's like, it changes the way you think about archival research, to think a historian who went before you might have moved things around, So I kind of couldn't shake it. And then, 10 years later, I started to write about it.
Believe it or not, sort of the first time I thought it was one day in an afternoon in 1979. I first became introduced to Rav Kook's writings in the fall of 1978. And I went to Israel and studied in Yeshivat Har Etzion, made their acquaintance through my late revered teacher, Rabbi Yehudah Mital, and with a late night chavruta with a friend of mine named Michael Barris. And Rav Kook's teachings just captivated me. As I got into him, I subsequently discovered that he had been very connected to my family before, though it hadn't been talked about much for reasons, I don't know, maybe my brother and sister have a better idea why that was. Rabbi Rafi Feuerstein once put it really well in a talk I heard him give, where he said, you're a yeshiva boy and you're going along, but you're also interested in political questions, you're interested in aesthetics, you think that maybe non-Jews have what to say, you're interested in ethical questions and social justice, you like learning the halachic passages of the Gemara, but you also really like learning the agadic, sort of the non-legal passages. You're kind of drawn to poetry, and you figure this makes you a second-class yeshiva boy. And then you read Rav Kook, this colossal rabbinic figure, a major halachic authority, outsized, and he tells you, no, this actually makes you a really good Jew. And it was just mind-blowing, right? And there was something so comforting and so inspiring, and so this idea that everything that people look at as quote-unquote secular culture that's outside the bounds of Torah and mitzvot, he's saying, no, actually, that's pulsating with holiness too. And then also he was so important, and I was studying in yeshiva on the West Bank in the late 1970s, where he was very much in the air. And I remember one day in Beit Midrash, we were getting ready for Mincha, and I was gripped by the sense that I'd never thought of myself as somebody who would write biographies. To this day, I don't see myself as a biographer kind of guy, kind of writer, and yet I was gripped by the sense that one day I'm going to have to write his biography. And so then in the around the turn of 2000, I wrote a doctoral dissertation about him. And then I was invited by Steve Sipperstein, who was co-editing this Yale series, to write this short biography of him. So that's how it all came to be.
I just want to quickly respond to what Lisa was saying about theft and archives, and I just want to share with everybody that one of the interesting things about getting fascinated by biblical translations is realizing how many Bibles have been stolen from libraries around the world. You get there and you're all excited. You're like, ooh, there's this 1825 translation just, right outside my office. It's gone. So that's been very interesting.
It's funny because I don't remember which hotel chain started to put dictionaries as well, but they said they kept getting stolen. But the Bibles, nobody ever took the Bibles. So The only place you can't find Bibles in hotel rooms, by the way, is in Israel.
Is in Israel.
You want to check something in Israel in a hotel, you're out of luck. But fortunately, if you're in, but the Mormons make sure you have one. Anyway.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. Okay, but to answer the original question, what inspired this? I think the shock I felt when I was sitting in Marilyn Robinson's class and listening to people read out loud from the Oxford Annotated Bible and from the King James, that's what motivated me. I really didn't recognize some key parts of the Tanakh in translation. And as you can probably see, I'm pretty expressive. And, Marilyn would stop the class and say, "Why are you so surprised?" And so this book was my effort to answer that question.
Beautiful answer.
Yeah.
Well then, with that, let us say that what you got tonight were both translations and interpretations, but wonderful ones from very gifted, and that is of course part of the translation is an interpretation, but also Judaism, unlike other traditions, is an interpretive tradition.
Absolutely.
So we don't stop with the text, and you see this in 3 different iterations, both with the biblical text itself, with one of its greatest modern interpreters, and the way in which history gets interpreted by the choice and the selection of the artifacts of history itself. And finally, I would say, one of the ways that you interpret is by highlighting things. And by giving someone a prize or making somebody part of you say, this statement is important and this idea is important. And so in that sense, I think the Rohr family and the Rohr Prize are important modern interpreters of Judaism. And we're grateful to them for making this evening and this interpretation possible.
Yeah.
And thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.